In the late summer heat of California, when the air shimmered above the empty lots along San Fernando Road, no one could have predicted that a group of men working out of old pottery and glassware buildings would one day shape the future of aviation. Yet this unlikely birthplace, an abandoned china factory and a glassworks warehouse, became the cradle of one of America's greatest aerospace giants, Lockheed. It is difficult, decades later, to imagine the contrast. Today, names like Lockheed summon images of jet fighters, black projects, and advanced engineering. But in 1928, the company was a small, struggling workshop filled with the smell of sawdust, glue, and the sharp bite of varnish. Its future depended not on metal or machinery, but on a very different kind of material, wood. And not just any wood. Sitka spruce, the same timber used for the world's finest violins and ships. That was the world the young Harvey Kristen stepped into when, as a Pasadena teenager seeking temporary work, he first walked through the brick archway of the old China factory. The Lockheed Aircraft Company, still spelled Lowhead in earlier years, was tiny then. Fewer than 100 employees, no vast production lines, no hangars, no paved runway, just determined men with drafting boards, hand tools, and a belief that aviation's future belonged to them. The founders and the Vega. Leading this small band of craftsmen was Alan Lockheed, joined by his brothers Malcolm and Victor. Working beside them was their brilliant but intense chief designer, Jack Northrop, a man whose ideas would later influence entire generations of aircraft. These were pioneers, not executives. Their offices were drafting tables. Their boardroom was whatever table wasn't covered in shavings or blueprints. Their masterpiece was the Lockheed Vega, a streamlined wooden monoplane that would soon become one of the most iconic aircraft of the golden age of flight, built almost entirely of Sitka spruce, fuselage, wings, bulkheads, all carefully laminated. The Vega was crafted more like a fine piece of furniture than an airplane. It was strong, astonishingly light, and wonderfully aerodynamic. Kristen remembered the craftsmen who built it, not metal workers, but cabinet makers. Men who shaped wood to tolerances so precise they could rival the best machinists. They built temporary jigs and molds by hand, forming ribs and laminating bulkheads with 20 or 30 layers of spruce. The result was a structure so strong that a simple quarter-inch spruce strip could withstand 24,000 psi, and when laminated into a bulkhead, the strength soared to over 120,000 psi, comparable to high-grade steel of the era. It was aviation's wooden cathedral. The crash of 1929, a company on the brink. Yet even the best craftsmanship could not protect Lockheed from what was coming. In 1929, the stock market collapsed. The Great Depression swept across the country with the force of a storm, and the little Burbank workshop suddenly found itself fighting for survival. Orders dried up. Cash evaporated. Skilled men were laid off. The Vega, fast, beautiful, admired, could not save the company. Lockheed's owners were approached by Detroit Aircraft Corporation, a group with ambitious dreams of becoming the General Motors of the air. Lockheed was acquired alongside other aviation ventures. For a brief moment, it seemed like salvation. But as the Depression deepened, Detroit Aircraft collapsed under its own financial weight. Factories shuttered, debts mounted. Lockheed, just one division, was swept toward bankruptcy with everything else. For a time, the entire company consisted of only 3 people: Carl B. Squire, the Detroit executive sent to keep Lockheed alive, Ronald King, the bookkeeper, Harvey Kristen, the teenage factory worker who suddenly became the entire operations department, responsible for parts, repairs, shipping, and anything else that needed doing. Everything was paid in cash envelopes. There was no payroll department, no administrative structure. There was only determination. California receivership laws prevented the company from being sold off in pieces, which saved it from disappearing forever. Lockheed remained a single intact asset, waiting for someone brave enough, or foolish enough, to buy it. The day that changed everything that moment came in June 1932. A group of investors led by Robert E. Gross, joined by Squire himself, Cyril Chappelle, Walter Varney, a name later associated with United Airlines, and others, scraped together $40,000, an audacious sum in the depths of the Depression. Crisson remembered the day of the court sale vividly. Squire suggested he attend, quietly, in the back of the courtroom. So he drove the Lockheed truck downtown and watched the proceedings. When Gross handed the check to the judge, the old man paused and looked directly at him. "Young man," he said, "I hope you know what you're doing." Gross replied with conviction, "Yes, sir." The judge brought his gavel down, sold. In that echoing crack of wood on wood, the fate of Lockheed, and much of American aviation, changed forever. 1930s, famous pilots and rising reputation. Under Gross's leadership, Lockheed surged back to life. The Vega and its derivatives began attracting attention from the world's most daring aviators. Wiley Post, wearing his early pressure suit, set altitude records and circled the globe, first with a navigator, then alone. Roscoe Turner, flamboyant and theatrical, raced his Lockheed for Gilmore Oil with a live lion as his mascot. Sir Charles Kingsford Smith crossed the Pacific in a Lockheed Altair, and the Magyar brothers flew the Justice for Hungary Altair across the Atlantic, making international headlines. Each success burnished Lockheed's reputation. Each daring flight showed what the little wooden airplanes from Burbank could do. A company. Transformed by now, the Lockheed Aircraft Company had grown beyond its humble beginnings. The old China factory and glassworks buildings, still standing in Burbank, were expanded and repurposed into fabrication shops, assembly rooms, and offices. They were cramped, outdated, and sometimes dangerous, but they were alive with activity. Crisson, now a seasoned Lockheed man, worked through nearly every branch of the company. He witnessed firsthand the increasing sophistication of designs, the arrival of new engineers, and the gradual evolution from handcrafted wooden airplanes to modern metal aircraft. The transformation accelerated when a young engineer named Clarence Kelly Johnson arrived. Sharp-minded, demanding, and brilliant, he would soon reshape everything, but his story belongs to later chapters. For now, Lockheed was a company reborn, rescued from bankruptcy, strengthened by craftsmanship, and propelled by the daring achievements of aviators who trusted their lives to its wooden wings. The stage is set. As the 1930s drew to a close, storm clouds gathered over Europe. Nations rearmed, air forces expanded. Military planners sought new aircraft with greater range, speed, and reliability. Lockheed, once on the brink of extinction, stood ready. The humble wooden Vega had carried explorers, racers, and legends into the sky. But the era of wood was ending. A new age was about to begin, an age of aluminum, war, and unprecedented innovation. And Lockheed would be at the center of it. The rebirth of Lockheed in the early 1930s marked not just a financial turnaround, but a profound shift in identity. The company that had once shaped wood like a master luthier was about to step into the metallic age, an age defined by rivets, aluminum skins, and the daring ambition of engineers who believed they could challenge the limits of flight. At the very heart of this transformation stood three forces: a new generation of aircraft, a new class of aviators, and a young engineer whose influence would echo across decades. One of the first signs that Lockheed was evolving came with the transition from the wooden Vega to the sleeker, stronger, more versatile metal monoplane. The engineering team, now reinforced after the company's revival, began pushing toward designs that could outperform anything produced in the wooden era. Their breakthrough came in the form of the all-metal Model 10, the Lockheed Electra. The Electra was not just another airplane. It was a statement. Lockheed was ready for the future. Streamlined, twin-engine, and built with a monocoque aluminum fuselage, the Electra delivered the strength, reliability, and speed demanded by a changing aviation world. Its design incorporated new aerodynamic principles, new structural philosophies, and, thanks in large part to one driven young engineer, new stability solutions that would become Lockheed trademarks. That young man was Clarence Kelly Johnson. Today, his name is synonymous with the Skunk Works and the most advanced aircraft on the planet. But in 1933, he was just a graduate fresh from the University of Michigan, barely making $83 a month as a tool designer. And yet, even then, Johnson possessed a confidence and clarity that set him apart. When he examined the early Electra prototype, he concluded, quietly but firmly, that it was unstable. His superiors sent him back to Michigan with a scale model and a challenge. Prove it. Working alone in the familiar wind tunnel he had used as a student, Johnson tested the Electra under every configuration he could imagine. 72 trials later, he returned to Burbank with the data, the diagrams, and the recommended fix. Replace the single vertical stabilizer with twin rudders mounted at the ends of the horizontal tailplane. This, he argued, would provide greater control, better directional stability, and improve performance, especially in the event of a single engine failure. Management approved it. And with that decision, Lockheed gained not only a safer aircraft, but an iconic silhouette, one that would become instantly recognizable to pilots across the world. Even with its technical merits, the Electra might have entered aviation history quietly, like so many other aircraft of its time, had it not caught the attention of one extraordinary woman, Amelia Earhart. Earhart was already a symbol of courage and modern womanhood when she first approached Lockheed. But what set her apart, even among other daring pilots, was her hands-on approach to aviation. She didn't just want to fly the Electra, she wanted to understand it. She arrived at the Burbank factory wearing coveralls, not a dress, and walked straight into the assembly shop. There, surrounded by cabinet makers and metal workers, she studied her aircraft as it was built. She asked questions about fuel lines, wiring, weight distribution, and the complex plumbing of dual power plants. She knelt beside mechanics as they tightened bolts and installed control fittings. She examined wing spars, watched as fuel tanks were fitted into the wings, and followed the team to the flight line for tests. To the Lockheed workers, she was never a celebrity. She was part of the crew. Earhart's first Little Red Vega had already carried her across the Atlantic as the first woman to complete the crossing alone. But with the Electra, she sought something far more ambitious: a flight around the world. The Model 10E built for her was heavily modified. It carried over 1,100 gallons of fuel, special navigation equipment, and heavier engines. Once again, she donned her coveralls and worked side by side with Lockheed's power plant specialists, studying the plumbing of fuel valves and electrical feeds. Her commitment earned her deep respect inside the factory. She treated the machine not as a vehicle, but almost as a living companion she needed to understand completely. Amelia was not the only aviation legend walking the shop floors in those years. Charles Lindbergh and his wife Anne Morrow Lindbergh were frequent visitors, monitoring the progress on their Lockheed Sirius. Lindbergh, already a world icon after his transatlantic flight, brought Lockheed invaluable credibility and important design challenges. The Sirius was originally built as a land plane, but Lindbergh intended to use it as a survey aircraft for Pan American's Pacific routes. That meant it needed to operate from open water. Adding floats dramatically changed its center of gravity, handling characteristics, and takeoff performance. Lockheed's engineers were forced to reinvent the aircraft's behavior from the ground up. Anne Lindbergh, meanwhile, trained as navigator and radio operator, becoming one of the earliest female specialists in long-distance aeronautical navigation. Testing the floatplane version was a spectacle in itself. A smooth sea made takeoff nearly impossible, so crews dispatched a high-speed boat to churn up waves ahead of the aircraft. Lindbergh would then use the turbulence to break the floats free of the water, a maneuver that demanded precision, nerve, and perfect timing. Then there was the flamboyant Howard Hughes, who arrived at the Burbank plant flying a small Boeing fighter, asking Lockheed to transform it into a racing aircraft. Johnson and the engineering team stripped it to its skeleton, reshaped it with sleek metal skin, installed a powerful engine, and optimized it for speed. That single project forged a long relationship between Hughes and Lockheed, one that would later produce the Lockheed Model 14 Super Electra used in his record-setting round-the-world flight, completed in just over 14 days. Each of these giants, Earhart, Lindbergh, Hughes, brought prestige, pressure, and new expectations to Lockheed. Their presence shaped the company's imagination. If these pilots trusted Lockheed, the world would too. Meanwhile, Lockheed continued to expand beyond its modest beginnings. The company purchased adjacent land, converted abandoned industrial buildings into assembly bays, and grew its workforce year after year. But as impressive as the Electra was, the world outside the factory was changing far faster than the aviation industry expected. By the mid-1930s, Europe trembled on the brink of war. Air forces demanded aircraft with greater range, speed, and reliability. The Electra caught the attention of militaries around the world, including the British, who were desperately seeking patrol aircraft. Their visit to Burbank in 1938 would soon change Lockheed's destiny forever. But that turning point belongs to the next chapter. For now, Lockheed was no longer simply a revived workshop. It had become a company of global reputation, home to engineers reshaping aviation and pilots rewriting history. The transition from wood to metal was complete, and the future was rushing toward them, faster than anyone could imagine. They say history turns on single moments. For Lockheed, one such moment came on a warm California afternoon in 1938, when a group of British officials, exhausted, overworked, and increasingly desperate, walked through the doors of the Burbank plant. Europe was sliding toward catastrophe. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic. Britain needed airplanes, and fast. Not someday. Not next year. Now. What happened over the next few days would not only reshape Lockheed as a company, but influence the entire course of World War II. And it all began with a challenge that seemed, at first, impossible. The 5-day miracle. When the British Purchasing Commission arrived in Southern California, Lockheed wasn't even on their original list. Only a last-minute change in schedule brought them to Burbank. But once inside, they found something none of the other manufacturers possessed: a team of engineers who could take an idea and turn it into reality at breathtaking speed. The British wanted a coastal patrol bomber, long-range, rugged, capable of hunting submarines along Britain's exposed shores. Lockheed had nothing of the sort, but they did have the Model 14 Super Electra, a fast, efficient twin-engine transport, and they had Kelly Johnson. Given only 5 days, Johnson and a small group of engineers worked around the clock. They didn't sleep. They barely ate. They redesigned the aircraft structurally and internally to turn a civilian airliner into a warplane. And they didn't stop at drawings. They built an entire full-scale wooden mock-up in the old China factory building. By the 5th day, the British delegation walked into a hangar and saw not sketches, Not concepts, but a life-sized aircraft interior, every control, every crew station, every bomb rack precisely where it needed to be. They were astonished, but the story didn't end there. When Lockheed executives traveled to England for follow-up meetings, the Air Ministry abruptly changed the design specifications. Johnson locked himself alone in a London hotel room for 3 straight days. 72 hours later, he emerged with a completely re-engineered version of the aircraft. The British signed the contract. 200 Hudson bombers, the largest single foreign order ever placed with an American manufacturer up to that time. Lockheed had just stepped onto the world stage. A company transformed overnight. The Hudson contract triggered an industrial explosion in Burbank. Before the war, Lockheed's production lines were modest. After the contract, they had to scale to levels never before attempted. The tiny workshops of the 1920s were now hopelessly inadequate. New buildings sprang up westward across fields, orchards, and even public streets. Entire blocks of Burbank disappeared under steel and concrete as Lockheed expanded relentlessly from San Fernando Road to Buena Vista Street. Every department grew. Every skill was needed. Every engineer, draftsman, welder, carpenter, and mechanic suddenly found themselves swept into a vast movement, one that felt as much patriotic as industrial. And it was only the beginning. Enter the lightning. While the Hudson Line accelerated, another project, conceived even earlier, was rising to prominence, the P-38 Lightning. It was unlike anything else flown by any nation. A futuristic twin-boom fighter with turbo-supercharged engines, heavy armament, and incredible high-altitude performance. It was fast, so fast that on its first cross-country test in 1939, it shattered the transcontinental speed record despite crash landing short of the runway. But the Lightning had challenges. High-speed dives created aerodynamic compressibility effects, deadly and poorly understood at that time. Pilots encountered control lockups. Test aircraft broke apart. The entire program teetered on disaster. Kelly Johnson went back to the wind tunnel. His team redesigned the wing structure, refined the dive flaps, and modified the airframe. Slowly, the P-38 matured into one of the most effective fighters of the war. In the Pacific, American aces would later swear by it. Richard Bong, Thomas Maguire, and Charles McDonald all recorded most of their victories in P-38s. The fork-tailed devil, the Germans called it, feared, respected, unmistakable. And it was built in Burbank, side by side with the Hudson, on assembly lines that grew more efficient by the month. Assembly lines like no other. At its peak, Lockheed ran parallel production lines, Hudsons on one side, P-38s on the other, both feeding a war effort expanding across multiple continents. They rolled aircraft out onto the test strip, still merely a dirt runway between railroad tracks and Empire Avenue. From that dusty strip, future legends first touched air. Amelia Earhart's Vega had flown from here. Wiley Post's Winnie Mae had taken off here. Now, machines of war departed in constant rhythm. Test pilots such as Milo Burcham, Tony Levier, and Fish Salmon became iconic figures within the company. Tony Levier, especially, pushed the P-38 to its limits, performing the kind of maneuvers, flat spins, forced recoveries, violent dives, that would terrify anyone else. He flew not for glory, but because the aircraft needed to be understood, mastered, proven. Over the roar of engines, the clang of tools, and the heat of welding torches, Burbank became one of the busiest aircraft factories in the world, the Vega Company and the Flying Fortress. Even with Lockheed's massive expansion, the war demanded more, much more. The U.S. government needed additional factories to build Boeing's B-17 Flying Fortress. Lockheed created a wholly owned subsidiary, the Vega Aircraft Corporation, named in honor of the wooden Vega that had made the company famous a decade earlier. At the height of production, Vega constructed more than 2,000 B-17s, many with improvements developed in-house. One of their most famous contributions was the chin turret, added to the nose to defend against frontal attacks. Pilots ferrying B-17s overseas quickly learned to prefer any aircraft bearing Vega's signature turret. Those planes, they joked, were the ones that got home. The Burbank airport area transformed into a sprawling city of industry. Buildings rose almost overnight, each one packed with jigs, presses, riveters, transformers, and tools. From above, the factory expanded so rapidly it looked like time-lapse footage of a metropolis growing from farmland. Camouflage, hiding a city. But as production accelerated, so did fear. After Japanese submarines shelled the California coast near Santa Barbara in early 1942, the West Coast panicked. A strike on Lockheed would cripple America's ability to wage war. The solution was extraordinary and almost surreal. Lockheed built a massive camouflage net over the entire factory complex. But it wasn't just a net. Engineers constructed wooden frames and trusses above the buildings, then stretched layers of chicken wire across them. On top, artists created a fake suburban neighborhood. Grass, streets, small houses, trees, fences, even cars, painted onto canvas and cardboard. From above, the enormous industrial plant disappeared, replaced by what looked like a quiet residential district. Only one clue betrayed the deception: a railroad line that began and ended in the middle of the neighborhood. Workers below cursed as feathers and debris drifted into their hair and onto the aircraft. But it worked. The disguise was convincing enough that many pilots later recalled flying over Burbank and not realizing a major factory lay beneath them. America's arsenal of democracy. As production reached its peak, Lockheed became a central pillar of Franklin D. Roosevelt's arsenal of democracy. The numbers are staggering. By 1945, the Burbank factories had built nearly 19,000 combat aircraft. Hudson bombers, Venturas, P-38 Lightnings, B-17, Flying Fortresses, PV-2, Harpoons, countless subassemblies and spare parts. This was in addition to aircraft built at sister factories around California and beyond. The workforce exploded from hundreds to tens of thousands. Some estimates place the total between Lockheed and Vega near 100,000 employees at the height of production. The company recruited from every corner of California: farmers, housewives, clerks, students, retired machinists, anyone willing to work, and among them were thousands of women. Rosie the Riveter, the women of Lockheed. If one symbol captures America's wartime industrial spirit, it is the image of Rosie the Riveter. And nowhere was Rosie more real than at Lockheed. Women made up nearly 40% of the workforce. They riveted fuselages, wired instrument panels, assembled hydraulic systems, built fuel tanks, and calibrated bomb release mechanisms. Their dexterity and precision often exceeded that of the male workers they replaced. Many departments preferred them for the most delicate assembly tasks. Harvey Kristen and other veterans of the early days watched with pride as these women mastered skills no one had expected them to perform. They came in as novices. Many had never touched an industrial tool, yet within weeks they became experts. Lockheed's workforce became a portrait of America in wartime: unified, determined, exhausted, inspired. From a small shop to a global force. The transformation from 1928 to 1945 defies belief. In less than 2 decades, Lockheed went from a wooden airplane shop in an old China factory to one of the most productive aircraft manufacturers in the world, from a company that almost died in the Depression to a cornerstone of Allied victory. The Hudson saved Britain in the early days of the war. The P-38 dominated the Pacific skies. The B-17 factories at Vega turned out fortresses at a pace once thought impossible. The world had changed. Lockheed had changed with it. And as the war drew to an end, no one could deny that the Burbank plant had become a symbol of American innovation, resilience, and industrial power. Yet even after the guns fell silent, Lockheed's story was far from over. Far larger challenges and far greater aircraft were already on the horizon. The jet age was coming, and Kelly Johnson was waiting.